Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode here in the Resto Saga Workshop. And this week we're talking about the 1976 Land Rover Series 3 88-inch diesel. I've had this vehicle now for over 10 years and the Land Rover's been in my family from new. It was first owned by my grandfather and then by my uncle and then by myself, and I restored it. There's been lots of videos made on the channel about that. This week we're going to talk about how to make your Land Rover a bit more usable. Now my particular Land Rover is a diesel, but the Series 3 came in a 2.25 diesel and a 2.25 petrol, and that largely covers the most of them. And I'm going to talk about both models and as to how you can make them a bit more, not necessarily reliable, but for usable on our modern roads. As these vehicles were not built for our modern roads, it's always good to think of upgrades and modifications that you can get more use out of them, because old vehicles enjoy being used. So without any further ado, let's get over to the Land Rover. So for various reasons I haven't been able to get the Land Rover out this week, and this little oil puddle underneath the front right swivel might give you a little bit of suggestion as to why. But we're fully capable of giving you a little bit of an interesting talk about the Land Rover usability. First of all, we're going to think about the engine. So let's open up the bonnet and take it from there. As I said at the start, that my Land Rover in particular is fitted with the 2.25 litre diesel engine, and this engine is always much maligned by series owners as not being particularly powerful or useful really for the modern age, and I don't always agree with this. Whenever these engines are in good condition and the engine timing is set correctly, they are perfectly reliable and perfectly useful, easily maintained, and there's very little to go wrong with them. But I would say the number one point is engine timing, and that is adjusted by the pump swivel as if you were setting a distributor on a petrol, but I'm going to come back from that. In terms of getting a little bit more power out of the diesel without doing any major work, mainly the only thing you can do is fit a pancake filter, and that's like a K&N filter that fits on here. Now, good sides of it, it supposedly gives you a few more horsepower, although I believe that's controversial. Downsides, it does make it a bit more noisy. But in terms of usability, I have driven this vehicle on motorways. I take it to work occasionally, although it is not my primary driver. And the main thing I would suggest doing is adding an extra earth lead, because the earth straps in these are not wonderful. And that's really throughout old Land Rovers. And again, it's probably a controversial thing to say. I added this as an additional earth, and the biggest battery I could, capacity-wise, that I could fit in the battery box. And that means cold starting is a dream. In terms of petrol engines, the two blocks are very similar. Obviously 3 bearing and 5 main bearing made the difference there. They obviously have a distributor here instead of a diesel pump, and spark plugs instead of injectors. For petrol engines, as with most classic petrol engines, you could consider fitting electronic ignition, which is not an expensive upgrade, and it gives you a stronger spark and it gives you better reliability in terms of points and gaps and all those bits and pieces that you have to think about. Heaters, I've seen quite a few mentions of upgrades for heaters from VWs, from boat heater motors and so on, but the main thing I would suggest is sealing between the heater and the bulkhead, and that definitely gives you a bit more comfort for long distance driving. In terms of brakes, you can consider, if I'm not going to punch the engine bonnet today, you can consider fitting a servo in here. That'll certainly give it a bit more ease to the pedal and a bit more strength. Certainly consider that. In terms of cooling, also making your life a bit more easy on a daily basis, these engines are largely overcooled, so you're not really going to have to worry too much about that, but you may wish to consider fitting an aluminium radiator, but always use the blue coolant, as that agrees a bit better with the cast iron block. Also, while I'm around the front here, you might want to think about headlights. Obviously, coming into the winter, you're doing more driving on the dark roads, especially if you're using it on a daily basis. You could, if you wish, consider upgrading the whole light unit to an LED unit. Those are available, but they're quite expensive, so you may wish to consider using halogen bulbs. You can buy LED bulbs that fit in the original non-seal beam glass lenses, but you need to check that they're appropriately E-marked to make sure you're using legal lights. So let's get the bonnet closed up and think of a few more aspects of making your Land Rover a bit more usable. So before I start talking about freewheeling hubs, please excuse the copper grease. This was my son who was making merry with the copper grease tin. Freewheeling hubs are a period accessory which you may wish to consider fitting. They disengage the drive from the front hub, therefore your front prop shaft doesn't have to turn. Again, like a lot of things in Land Rover world, they are a little bit controversial. Some people say they're not worth their money, but I think in long term, realistically, you are going to save on wear and tear, and probably a little bit in miles per gallon as well, as you're not having to drive the front prop shaft, front differential, and 2 half shafts. So something to consider anyway. They're not overly expensive, and yes, it might take a while for you to make your money back, but realistically, if you're doing a lot of driving on the roads, you're not going to need 4-wheel drive availability at the drop of a hat by putting in your yellow knob or using your red knob. In here, what have I done to make my life a bit more comfortable? Well, I fitted this right off-road soundproofing mat, and that made a huge difference. I can't remember the exact cost. It's quite similar to the Exmor trim item. In fact, I think he might actually supply Exmor trim, but don't quote me on that. It's very easy to fit. I could probably fit it in an evening if I dedicated myself to it, but it really dampens down on vibrations, and it's just a brilliant job. It's molded over the seat box, over the floors, gearbox tunnel, and over the bulkhead as well. I have the little bits that fit in here, but this one is left off at the minute. So it's just a really nice tidy job, and just looks great and works very well. Probably one of the best upgrades I've done to my Land Rover, to be honest. The other top-notch one, more difficult to video really, is the overdrive. And I got a ferry overdrive way back before I started making videos seriously. And I rebuilt it myself from instructions I found on the internet and by buying the bearings off the internet too. eBay being great for that sort of thing. Overdrive on a diesel really adds to your economy and your comfort. I use it only really in 4th gear unless I forget about it and leave it engaged, but it really cuts down the engine revs. I don't really go any faster with it, but it just makes it a bit less noisy. So the combination of the right off-road mat and your overdrive really make the drive a lot more civilized. You can get a Rocky Mountain overdrive. They use a different gearing system. I think they're called epicyclic. I'm not an engineer, but they share the oil with the transmission or the transfer box rather than the ferry, which has its own very tiny oil reservoir. So that's the downside of the ferry. They do tend to be noisy and they have their own oil. So if there's a leak between the ferry and the transfer box, the ferry tends to get starved of oil, and the oil change intervals are quite frequent. If you're looking for longer gearing, you could consider fitting taller ratio differentials, front and rear, or you could also consider fitting a high ratio transfer box. I think Ashcroft make the parts relevant for that, but that do require a bit of machining work, so probably it's not necessarily a sort of a bolt-on option like an overdrive would be. Although these things are getting very expensive, something to consider. In here, my Land Rover's largely stock. Big upgrade, when I say big, it was pretty cheap, but it makes your life a lot easier. I fitted LED bulbs to the dashboard lights, and that makes them a whole lot easier to look at night time. When I say easier to look at, they're a lot more visible, and it also uses less power. You may also be able to fit a little voltmeter. I got this one off eBay. It's an original option, and if you can find one of those, it certainly makes you aware of what power you're using. Up here, believe it or not, probably one of the best things I've added to the Land Rover. I think this was £3, came from China, off eBay, and it's great for holding your phone because there's nowhere else to put it. And eventually I'm going to make a little phone charger that plugs into here, up and round, and just clips on so that I can keep my phone charged while I'm on the road. Definitely very easy. And if you've got kids, child seat fits in beautifully. Makes your life a whole lot easier, and means the little ones can come along and keeps Mrs. Restosaga very happy when I take them out for a run. In the back, the main thing I've added is this back bench seat, and I'll put a little link up so you can watch the fitting video for that. This being the hardtop, had no back seats, but fitting this means Mrs. Restosaga can come along. Eventually we'll probably fit another one on the other side as well and soundproof the inside here, and I'm going to cover all that in various videos. But that certainly adds to usability, as does that big thick rubber mat, which is actually stable matting, and it's cut to the size, and I think it's 3 foot by 4 foot, and it really keeps the noise down in the back. Let's close up this door. The last real thing I think about when making the Land Rover more usable is the roof rack. It's amazing, I don't really own a modern car with a roof rack or something that I could carry bits and pieces on, but roof rack off eBay, and it's an, I don't know how to pronounce that, ICO. Those roof bars were not very expensive, and I might consider buying a third just so I can carry my kayak on it. Strongly recommend that, and when I get the bike rack eventually made up, which I was talking about last week, that'll definitely improve things for family usability. My rear work lamp, which is wired in there, is a little stroke of genius, if I might say so. It's an LED work lamp, which is wired into the 3-position switch here. So no lights, instrument lights, and then you put it the whole way down, you get your rear work lamp on. So it's difficult enough to leave it on inappropriately, but if you're trying to reverse, there's no reversing light here in the 1976 Land Rover. This is something you could definitely consider. So I think, to be honest, that's largely about it. I'm struggling to think of anything more that I would suggest doing, other than whenever you're going through it, use the best quality materials you can, and the highest quality oils in your engine, gearbox, axles, grease for the prop shafts, and always use stainless bolts. Yes, if you're looking for originality, stainless is not the best answer, but at the end of the day, if you're looking for originality, you're probably not going to be using it every day. So definitely something to consider in the long term, because it makes your life so much easier. And so there you have it, my guide on how to make your Land Rover a bit more usable, featuring most of the things that I have done myself. Some things like freewheeling hubs are definitely in the pipeline, and as my next video is probably going to suggest, there's some problems with my engine, so I'm going to be talking through different engine options. I found a little crack in the block of my Land Rover, so that's really going to make me think about what I'm going to do next to the Land Rover. There's no point in spending any more money on that engine if the block is cracked, because it's effectively scrap. But we're going to have a talk about that in a future episode. So thanks very much for watching. Give the video a like and fire me a comment. I reply to them all, and I'm really happy to hear from you all. Also hit the subscribe button, because that's the best way to keep up to date with all my videos. And as I've suggested, there's going to be plenty more to come working on the Land Rover, as well as my other projects here in the garage. Hit the little bell icon as well if you want to be notified by when I make a video, but they come on 5 o'clock every Saturday. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. I like to give different updates throughout, and you can also find me on Patreon if you wish to support my channel there, and I'd like to thank MH Aquatics for continuing to support my work over on Patreon. So once again, thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you all again next week. Cheerio!